Good afternoon to everyone. I hope the morning went well. You listened to many exciting talks. But I am very excited to introduce a pioneer in our field. We are delighted to have with us Professor Christof Paar. He's really a pioneer in the area of hardware security, which is becoming increasingly important. Let me mention some of his achievements. Together with Gilles Bart, he was the founding director of the Max Planck Institute for Security and Privacy in Bochum, Germany. And as you are aware, this is now a top place for research in security and privacy. He's also a research professor at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. He co-founded, together with Setting Coach, the CHESS conference, which is a premier forum for research on hardware security. Christof received an ERC Advanced grant for research in hardware security and is a co-spokesperson for the DFG Cluster of Excellence, Cybersecurity in the Age of Large-Scale Adversary. For people who are not from Europe, ERC are European research grants, which are very big, very competitive to get, and they focus on basic important research. His research interests include hardware security, applied cryptography, and physical layer security. He's a fellow of the IEEE and of the ICR, which is the International Association for Cryptological Research. And of course, as you can expect, he has given many invited talks in many institutions worldwide, including Harvard, MIT, Oxford, Stanford, and Yale. I could talk much more, but I would like to give the floor to Christof, and we are very intrigued by his, the abstract of his talk.
Elisa, this is extremely kind. This is extremely kind. Yeah, thank you so much, and thanks for showing up here in the late afternoon European time and whatever time zone you're in. Yeah, so it's my pleasure to. I hope doing the right thing. Can you see my screen? Yeah, my slides.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. So I want to bore you for 45 minutes or so with my favorite research that I've been pursuing over the last 3 years, which is related to Trojans, in particular hardware Trojans. And as you can see from the title, most of my talk is, the nerdy technical engineering stuff that you expect at a conference is historic. But I also want to, in the beginning, touch a little bit about the political framework in which we are cooperating, and Lisa and I just had very nice philosophical thoughts about that. So so there are 4 parts to my talk. First, I want to talk a little bit about the introduction to hardware Trojans, and a few slides, as I just mentioned, a little bit the historical / political perspective on that, and then the boring part starts. I'm getting really technical, so I'm talking about 2 case studies, how to design Trojans that are extremely stealthy, meaning they're extremely hard to detect. And I think that's quite interesting. Okay. So what are hardware Trojans? I mean, they're self-explaining pretty much, right? So you have an integrated circuit you see in the center of the screen, and you somehow manipulate the functionality, in particular with the goal to have some malicious functionality. So why would anybody do that? What are the motivation? What are the applications, right? And actually, our field, the subfield of hardware manipulation, was actually historically motivated by the DoD. And the standard example is, so let's say you buy an expensive drone, by your favorite military contractor for $30 million, for instance, and it works perfectly fine, unless it's flying over China. Suddenly the GPS stops working, or it's flying over Germany, over Luxembourg or Italy, whatever you can think of, right? Why? Because maybe the GPS chips are maliciously manipulated, right? Maybe more of a European perspective is that critical infrastructure, everybody talks about the smart grid, but even without the smart grid that's envisioned, today's grid is already pretty smart, right? We saw the ransomware attack earlier this year against the oil pipeline in the US. So it would be extremely unpleasant, right, if some country builds in microchips for controlling the grid or the water or gas supply, and then some foreign nation can control that. And more on a personal level, of course, we can also think about manipulated chips that end up in millions or maybe billions of smartphones, and that could maybe lead to privacy violation, right? Maybe controlled by a nation-state actor, right? So again, there's this, the kind of bad guys could have reasons to do that. So the next question is, how would we? Now the next question is, what is the scientific community doing about that? So you see here, this is the Defense Science Task Force. This is part of the DoD, and they came up, they published a very influential report in about 15 years ago. And what you see here is Google Scholar a few years ago, where we looked how many publications are happening that are dealing with hardware Trojans, either in the title, that's the lower text, and you see prior to 2007, this area didn't exist essentially, right? And since then it has steadily growing. So people are paying attention to that, which is good, I guess, right? So, and now the next question maybe is, so how exactly would that happen? How can, at which point can we inject hardware Trojans? Interestingly, this Defense Science Board report was mainly worried about manipulation taking place during IC manufacturing. The reason being that almost all manufacturing is taking place outside the United States, right? So within a so-called fab, maybe the design is manipulated. An easier way of, another way of manipulating is so-called IP cores. People that are not familiar with hardware designs, if you're like, let's say, if my iPhone 8, if I open that up, there's one main chip with lots of functionality, and they're up to 200 IP blocks. You can think about that as like software that you buy at third-party vendors, and it's perceivable that some of these IP blocks, that means some of the hardware blocks you buy, are manipulated, for instance, so that they leak keys from an AES core, right? A totally different approach is that you, for instance, swap chips during shipments, right? So regular hardware against Trojanized hardware. And the easiest way, if it's built in by the manufacturer, right? I put Huawei here, and I do apologize. I know the sponsor, don't take it personally. This is not meant that Huawei is doing that, but you also can think about Siemens, which is a very German company, right? So what I find very interesting, coming back to the politics of that, I mentioned that, so these are attack vectors that the governments, our governments, the US government, I'm sure German governments, I'm sure many other governments are worried about. At the same time, we know from the Edward Snowden leaks that these attack vectors on the right-hand side are actually performed by the same governments that are worried about Trojans as well, right? So there's kind of like a yin and yang duality situation with that. If you go, if I'm done with this talk, or maybe while I'm talking, go to Wikipedia and type in NSA. What you see on the landing page, Wikipedia NSA, is this picture with which is allegedly, I took that from Wikipedia here, which is allegedly taken secretly inside an NSA lab, where people are opening packages and swapping chips, right? So this is maybe not all science fiction here, what we're seeing. Again, I think I find it quite interesting which role nation states play in this discussion here. So let's look, let's stay with nation states and look a little bit at the historical perspective. So probably most people know, at least have heard about the Enigma, which was this rotor-based machine that Nazi Germany used during World War II, which was successfully broken first by the Polish and then by Alan Turing and his team in England, and at the same time by the US military. These rotor machines were state of the art. So this was not like just a stupid German idea. US used a similar machine, which was unbroken, which was more secure, at a more sound design. And it was designed and sold by Boris Hagelin from Sweden with this company Cryptotechnic. And for a long time, it was rumored that he was the only person who ever made money out of cryptography, right? Interestingly, after World War II, the Cold War started, right? And what you could then buy a different encryption machine, which was produced by a different company, which was also owned by Boris Hagelin, which was located in Switzerland, the Crypto AG. So this is Crypto AG, and what emerged actually interestingly around 1990, so about 30 years ago, there was an article by Der Spiegel, which is a leading a news magazine in Germany, and they already alleged that there were, secret cooperation between the Crypto AG and the NSA, GCHQ in Britain, but also Bundesnachrichtendienst, which is kind of the German CIA, so to speak, here, right? And the alleged claim was that this encryption machine was artificially weakened in this Crypto AG. I mean, we're talking about 1960s, 1970s, 1980s. It was quite hard to get to buy in cryptography. They were one of the few suppliers, and then it was claimed that it was artificially weakened. So in our terminology, there were backdoors built in, maybe even Trojans. And by the way, this was not only alleged, because Washington Post came up with, seems to be like a confirmed fact. Okay, so let's go further. So what kind of, have we seen that this is true? Are these just newspaper article? So the people that are, in my age, right, they might vaguely remember there was a bombing in a Berlin discotheque when there was still East and West Berlin. It was in West Berlin, which was frequented by US soldiers, here, right? And a few US GIs got actually killed. And what happened, a few days later, Ronald Reagan launched cruise missiles towards Libya, and I think some relative of Gaddafi was actually killed during this airstrike. And then during the interview, actually, Ronald Reagan leaked some information, namely that they were able to read the diplomatic cables between Libya and the Libyan embassy in Berlin. And guess what? They used the Crypto AG encryption machine. So it was clear that the US could read that. And they concluded that Libya was behind this bombing in the Berlin discotheque. So this was kind of, almost not confirmed, but strong indications that actually backdoors were used and played a role in world politics here, right? So as probably many people in this room remember, until about 1908 or so, there was a pretty strict export control of cryptography in the United States, right? And in concrete terms, any product designed in the United States had to be limited to 40 bits of key, which is, ridiculously small as we know today, right? And there was a big political battle about this, and actually, in large part due to the actions of the EU, the US relaxed their crypto export rules here, right? And that was done by Bill Clinton. Yeah. So more recently, there was the FBI director declared we're going dark because of things such as end-to-end encryption, right? We all love WhatsApp and we all love Signal and Telegram, right? They're all very, very secure, right? They use AES 256, the FBI and German BKA, they can't break that stuff, right? So, and there's an ongoing discussion. And of course, what the law enforcement would love to have is, you guessed it, backdoors built in, right? So they don't have to go through all the pain and look at other ways of breaking crypto, which is not easy nowadays, right? And there is another, almost confirmed case. Again, many people in this room have heard about this in the leaked Edward Snowden document. From the leaked Edward Snowden document, we can conclude that most likely this dual ECC random number generator, which got standardized, is backdoor probably by an intelligence agency, right? So what we see really, there is a lot of interplay about with very current politics, right? And backdoors. Okay, we can even become more recent. So what started about 2 or 3 years ago is this whole discussion: how trustworthy is computer equipment, or in concrete terms, telecommunication equipment, right? 5G equipment, right? And there were 2 widely reported cases. One was this Bloomberg hack, and this is hard to say whether this is confirmed or not, but there are a lot of intense discussion, a lot of rumors, and I think nobody really know what happened. But you know, there were some cloud server main boards that had unwanted additional chips on it, right? Kind of a clumsy way of building hardware Trojans. But as I just mentioned, there's this big discussion, you know, which is very real. There's some, at least one European country that is not importing 5G hardware from certain companies because they say we can't really trust them, right? And I think this is an open question. So again, so in the last 2 slides, I wanted to give you a little bit an impression. So this is not only this nerdy, you know, we discover yet another vulnerability and maybe fix it, but there's a much bigger framework, political society framework where we act in. Okay, so let's get nerdy technical. Okay, so let's look at the first case study, how to build very stealthy Trojans, which is actually what the case study is a few years old that I'm going to present, but that motivated much of the ongoing research in my research group at the Max Planck Institute, right? So, you know, if German professors do great things, it's usually their postdocs and PhD students, right? And it was so much of the work was done by Georg Pavel and Marek here. Okay. So after all this discussion, right, that I gave you, you know, you would think, okay, let's look at hardware Trojans. The big problem, methodological problem is we haven't really observed hardware Trojans in the wild. You know, what we have kind of the proven cases is like crypto AG, but we don't have these machines. We would love to have that, right? There are plenty of examples, but they're almost all coming from people like me, you know, like some graduate students put some backdoor in an ECC core or an AES core and implement that on an FPGA. The big question is this really how smart intelligence services with you know good engineers and deep insights really design hardware Trojans, right? We don't really know. So you remember the earlier slides with the graph with the number of publications that we pulled from Google Scholar? Well, almost all of them deal with detection. So that was kind of the starting point of Georg and me a few years ago. Namely, we thought, why not designing Trojans? And this is totally analogous to doing cryptanalysis, for instance, of finding software vulnerabilities, right? So in terms of general approach, this is what security researchers do. And just designing Trojan is kind of easy, right? If you have full access, for instance, if the manufacturers, it's trivial, right? So we're a researcher, we like to make our life more interesting. So we ask ourselves, what are the smallest possible changes we have to do to a circuit so that we get a meaningful Trojan? And this is what I'm going to talk about now. So what I'm, okay, yeah, oops, there was one moment here. I'm struggling with my, sorry, I have really problem clicking through my slides. I have to, okay, one moment. Okay, because I'm, okay, yeah, one moment. Okay. Okay, can you, yeah. Can you see my screen again?
Yes, we can see.
Okay, yeah, yeah. I have some animation, it didn't work.
Sorry, Christof.
Yeah.
We only see your PowerPoint, but not your full screens.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, let me, thanks for, okay. Is this working better?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I do apologize. You know, we're 18 months in the pandemic and I'm still struggling with Zoom. Okay, so we looked at how to Trojanize an Intel core, right? And the basic idea is that we look at the simplest circuit elements that we have, which is an inverter, which you see is a CMOS inverter, right, with 2 transistors in the truth table. And we focus on this transistor. This is going to be Trojanized on the next slide, right? And what we want to have is a very simple change of functionality, as opposed to having an inverter. We want to have a constant 1 output, right? So, and one way of doing is essentially drawing, on the metal layer exactly the lines that you see on the right-hand side. The problem with that is that this is visible, right? As soon as you open the chip and inspect it, you find it. So the question is, can we achieve this functionality on the right-hand side with more subtle, more hidden, more stealthy methods? And this is what you see here. So this is a transistor seen from the side. If Intel, I'm going back here, if Intel talks about 7 nanometer technology, this is the gate width here, right? So what you see here is not to scale, right? So in reality, these are pretty tiny, the things. What you see is this doped areas, p-doped, positive doped areas in orange. And what we propose, instead of p-doping, you do n-doping. This is in technical terms not a problem, because 50% of the transistors are n-doped anyway. If you do that, you get this transistor that's always connected, right? That acts like a closed switch. That means we have this PMOS transistor, which is closed. You can do a similar trick on the bottom with the NMOS transistor, so that it's an open switch, and you get this functionality, right? It's always 1. And again, remember, it's very hard to see because we fiddle around with the atoms, right? Now, the 2 questions we have to ask ourselves. First of all, can this manipulation be detected? And then, which actually turns out to be the bigger question, how to build a useful Trojan, useful from an attacker's point of view. So what we hear, this is a mock thing, right? We took the same picture twice. So which one of these 2 inverters has a Trojan? You can't distinguish them because they're the same, right? We took the same picture. Again, remember, we did this manipulation within the silicon by fiddling around with the atoms. So this is totally invisible, right? Okay, so now let's try to answer the bigger question. So we can do this very simple thing, right? So we can essentially fix certain lines or certain gates or certain flip-flops to a fixed 1 or fixed 0, as opposed to being a switching element, right? So how can we turn that into a real Trojan? The basic answer is here. Instead of going in some complicated part of the logic, the ALU or something, or the microcode, we look at the true random number generator, which is included on the Intel core, but also all AMD and ARM cores have that too, right? Why do people use random number generators? We know that, right? Everybody goes to Isoric, knows we use it for all stuff that bad people try to manipulate, right? Secure web browsing, email encryption, signing of PDFs, blah, 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 blah. And now the basic idea is to inject the dopant Trojan here. Let's see how that works. And again, this works against most modern TRNG, so it's not specific to Intel. So how people build true random number generators nowadays is you have an entropy source, which is as most people think TRNG are about. So this is kind of some electronic circuit with some analog type of behavior. You get zeros and ones, but they're reliable, but not super reliable. So for instance, if the device gets old, if the device gets hot, maybe this entropy source gets biased. So what we do some kind of digital post-processing, which is some kind of hash type of scrambling. And then we get, for instance, 128-bit of crypto key out, right? So the regular operation, we have this number of keys. And the whole idea is by injecting the Trojan here that we can reduce this key space from 2 to the 128, for instance, to 2 to the 32 keys, right? That would be great because it's very easy to brute force here. How does this work? This is the example of the Intel. So what Intel does, and that's actually the flaw, they use AES as a hash function here, right? So they take the entropy source, they fill both the key register and the regular input register, the state register C, with random bits coming from this analog source. And then they run AES, and you see the state register can be incremented. So you run it in some kind of counter mode, which is helpful, for instance, if the entropy source is not quick enough, right? So in total, we have 256 random bits here. If you want to brute force that, you get this astronomically large number of cryptographic keys, right? So good luck with brute forcing them, right? We can't do that. You know, the German BND can't do it, the NSA can't do it, the Russians can't do it, the Chinese can do it, right? Can't do it. So this is way, way too big, right? So it takes like the lifetime of the universe or something, right? So now comes the Trojanized version. The only, in quotation marks, the only thing that we do, we are fixing some of the input bits, actually most of the input bits, to either fixed 0 or fixed 1. These are the Trojanized bits. How do we do that? With the silicon manipulation, with this manipulation, the alteration of the doping that you saw before. But what you can see on the lower left-hand side, we're not fixing all input bits. In this example, we leave 32 bits untouched. That means 32 bits are still, every time we evoke our true random number generator, filled with fresh random bits. And what's happening now, instead of this 2 to the 256 possible crypto keys, we get 1 billion possible crypto keys, 2 to the 32 roughly, right? Which seems a lot, but of course, testing them takes literally seconds on our laptop, right? At the same time, if you're a user of the system, you still get 1 million different cryptographic keys out. That means you can build a lot of TLS connections until you run out of crypto keys, right? Or until they start to duplicate here. Then one technicality, all hardware chips and hardware circuits and sub-circuits are being tested. So we also had to overcome this built-in self-test, because remember, we introduced this stack at 0 and stack at 1 fault in the true random number generator. And of course, what you see here, this is how the testing works. Like you provide known input and you should get deterministic 512-bit output. And of course, with the Trojan, you get the incorrect bits out, right? But what all hardware manufacturers do, they don't want to check 512 bits. They do data compression using CSC checksum. And I want to go into details, but in a nutshell, we make sure even though the 512-bit outputs from the circuit are incorrect because we injected a Trojan, we know how the CSC checksum works. Of course, it's reversible. So we make sure that the 32 bits still match. That means in the test mode, even the manufacturer wouldn't detect our Trojan. So what is the conclusion of this first case study? First, we got a lot of good press, right? We got Schneiert, right? We got in the Schneiert newsletter. That's what Georg said back then, right? I think the big insight is you can build meaningful hardware Trojans, which I think pretty scary, pretty powerful Trojans, without a single extra logic gate, right? It's nowhere that we introduced an additional NAND gate or something like that, right? Most detection techniques that have been proposed in literature will not work against this Trojan that we propose here, right? And the details, again, that was a chess a few years ago, where you can read the details. What is interesting, though, what happens the following year, chess 2014, there was a totally unrelated group from 2 groups in Japan, one from Mitsubishi Research, one from a university group in Japan. And they looked at our attack, and we always claimed, oh, this alteration of the doping that's invisible to see. What you see on this small picture here on the right-hand side is a standard electron microscope here. And using that, you can actually see these changes in doping, right? So it's possible. It's a pain, it takes time, but it's not that everything is lost, right? So as always in security, once you have the vulnerability, you will find countermeasures. And here, the dear colleagues from Japan showed, yeah, in principle, there are countermeasures available. So this whole research makes sense, right? So now I want to look at introduce a second case study for hardware Trojans. And this is related not to ASICs, so like real, in quotation mark, real hardware, but FPGAs, which stands for Field Programmable Gate Array. These are reconfigurable hardwares, right? They're widely used. There are several billion devices sold every year. What is interesting from a security point of view, they're often used in security critical application. For a long time, the company Cisco was the biggest purchaser of FPGAs worldwide, right? In router networks, they used a lot of aerospace, in medical technology, and so forth, right? So, and now we have to get a little bit technical. We have to look to some kind of almost like an artifact, how they work. So what you see is, I put in as representatives, Xilinx and Altera, the two manufacturers. They have about 90% of the world market. They're pretty powerful. They all work according to the following principle. So if you buy them at your favorite electronic vendors, they're dumb, right? They have, you know, the equivalent of millions of gates on it, but they don't have any functionality. You have to program them. This program happens with the help of a configuration file, which is called the bitstream in FPGA lingo. And what's the crucial thing here to observe is, for technological reasons, this is not on chips. This is on an external flash, right? This is an external module, external flash. And when you power your Cisco router up, the FPGA configures itself, meaning it's reading, you know, typically a few megabits or a few million bits are being read into your Altera or Xilinx device, and then it's configured and it, you know, runs a router, for instance, right? To make things a little, you know, just to give an example, for instance, if you want to implement AES in hardware, which is often done for performance reasons, this AES is hard-coded in this bitstream. So you can think the bitstream as the software or the firmware that configures your Xilinx Altera device. So the question that Pavel and I asked ourselves a few years ago, can we build hardware Trojans by manipulating the bitstream? The big advantage over the example I showed you earlier is we can do it in the lab, because what you guessed it, right? What we did before with this Intel manipulation, of course, Intel is not working with us, right? And we can't do this dopant manipulation ourselves. Here with the FPGA, you can have your own homegrown hardware Trojans, right? This is fun. So the idea that we have, the type of manipulation is relatively simple conceptually. We use AES, right? AES, as we know, is probably the most widely used cipher, at least in the Western world, right? And we want to replace the original AES with this AES with the red T, which stands for the Trojanized version for AES, which is, and there are many ways of doing that. I'm going to talk about that in a second, which is, but the only thing you really have to bear in mind is we artificially weaken AES, right? We can either, for instance, run that instead of 10 rounds or 14 rounds, it's a 1-round AES. We can replace the S boxes by weak S boxes, for instance, right? So it's pretty easy to make a crypto algorithm weak, right? So the first thing we have to do, if you look at the bitstream, the bitstream format is more or less unknown. It's proprietary, even though the people are working on that. So the first challenge we have, if you have this, you know, file with 10 million bits, how do you find in this bitstream the AES core, which is maybe only 2% of the area, right? So, and we wrote rather clever detection algorithms without fully reverse engineering the bitstream. What you see here are 8 implementations. You can totally ignore the table here. The only thing that's important. So these are 8 AES implementations for FPGAs we found on the internet. So they're not written by ourselves. The only thing important is the right-hand column. Using our detection mechanisms, we were able to detect 100%. So we detect all of them. And the basic idea, what we're doing, we're looking for the S boxes. Probably most of you have heard about S boxes in block ciphers. And what's an interesting observation, the S boxes need very specific structure. You need a high nonlinearity, which you normally don't observe in any other type of digital design. So it's very hard to hide S boxes. That means, and for us, you know, if you want to build Trojans, it's very easy to find block ciphers. So now, what is the attack scenario here, right? So the assumption is the attacker has temporarily access to a device, and the attacker wants to manipulate this device. Okay, so what we can do, you know, we find the AES in the bitstream, and what we do, we replace the original S boxes with new S boxes, which result in a weak cipher, right? So what we can do now, we inject this weak S boxes in the bitstream. We switch the on switch on. That means our device powers up, And you know, if you followed my explanation, now we have this Xilinx chip in the middle, which has a weak AES implementation, not the original standard conform AES. What we can do, you see that, right? It's the Trojanized version inside. What we can do as an attacker, we can feed plain text, we can get ciphertext back, but pay attention, this is not AES encrypted with the standard compliant AES, but with this Trojanized AES, right? And you know, and this is what we told ourselves for a long time. Well, this is kind of cute to do, but this is not interoperable, right? You get incorrect results. For instance, you can't use the ciphertext if you like Alice, right? If you manipulate Alice's device, send it over to Bob and Bob decrypt, because this is not interoperable with a regular AES. So the question is, how can we use that for exploitation, right? What kind of abuse can we do, right? We love doing bad things as researchers. And we found actually quite two application scenarios, again, from an attacker's point of view. The first useful attack, I think, is very interesting and probably not that far-fetched, right? As you can imagine, it's very interesting to, if you're cloud provider, that you, without even big asking, everything that's being stored in your cloud is encrypted, right? And it's also very interesting to do this encryption with hardware support on an FPGA, because this is runtime and energy critical, right? So typically, if you run encryption on an FPGA, you buy a factor 100 more energy efficient than doing that in software, right? So in the case of storage encryption, this attack works, right? You could inject a weakened AES, because there's one thing that's specific for storage encryption. Encryption and decryption is done by the same device, right? So what would happen if you follow through with our Gedanken experiment, with our thought experiment, as the user, you would send your plain text, right, through the internet, stored in the cloud. It's encrypted with this weakened AES. If you read it out, it's decrypted with the weakened AES, so everything would work. At the same time, whoever did that, let's say intelligence agency X, right, they know there's a weakened AES built in, and they could still break the ciphertext, because the ciphertext in the cloud is not strong. The other thing is key extraction, and that's a scenario, for instance, where you know there is for instance, a cryptographic key, maybe a session key, but more interesting, like a long-term key, is being used in AES. What you can do now for key extraction, you can do exactly what you see up there. So you run AES, you configure the Trojanized AES, you send plain text and ciphertext, and now you have this very classical scenario, right, that Alan Turing had when he broke the Enigma, right? You have plain text, you have ciphertext, but encrypted with a weak cipher. And what you can do now, you can use this weakened ciphertext for extracting the key, right? So that's a way of key extraction, which is way easier than maybe side channel attacks or invasive attacks, right? And again, this is a very specific attack scenario. You know, I'm not claiming this is useful in every time using AES in an FPGA. So what is the conclusion about from our second case study here? Well, first of all, what's interesting, I actually started my career in 1995 at WPI, Worcester Polytechnic Institute in Massachusetts. And back then, a few years later, in 97, 98, I got a career grant on pre-configurable hardware and crypto. And I'm not the only one. So a lot of people in my community, in the chess community, have been working on FPGAs and cryptography, but nobody looked at this as an attack vector, right? So what happens if we manipulate the bitstream? So I think this is quite interesting, right? As I mentioned before, just from a methodological point of view, this is fun because we can build hardware Trojans, you know, and they're not really hardware because we manipulate the bitstream, but the Trojan comes alive in the actual hardware later on in the lab, so we don't have to collaborate with Intel. You know, Intel hates us, of course. Of course, you know, if you people in this room say, okay, Christof is kind of cute, but this only works because the bitstream is unprotected, which is stupid, right? So why don't we encrypt the bitstream? You can do that, and Xilinx and Altera offered bitstream encryption. The problem is there's a whole history line of research, right? CCS 2001, FPGA 2013, we got the Usenix best paper, or not honorable mentioning, something like that last year at Usenix. what did we do? We broke the bitstream encryption. So the bitstream encryption that's available right now is not sound. So you can't really do bitstream protection. That means the attacks that we sketched here are possible in principle, right? The details were actually discussed in a journal paper that's a few years old, but there have been follow-up work on from us too. Okay, so if you want to learn about cryptography, go to my YouTube videos, right? Which is really cryptography for dummies, because we teach it to our freshmen. Thank you so much for your attention, and it was great giving the talk to that audience, and I'm looking very much forward to the Q&A session now.
Christof, thank you a lot for this very detailed presentation. Actually, it's very scaring though, because I now think about that now we have IoT devices, you know, devices like for cellular networks, like antennas, all this type of other technology, which, you know, may have the same issue. But before we have a question from the audience. Panicos is asking whether remote attestation could detect your Trojan.
I didn't get the question. Could you repeat? I'm sorry.
Is whether remote attestation, you know, these attestation techniques, which are mainly for software, could detect your Trojan?
I think the second one probably, yes. So if you do remote attestation, and again, this is bitstream. So if you can remotely attest them, you know, or run some cryptographic checksum over that, you would probably detect that. But then, I mean, once we start this discussion, we could probably argue, okay, so then the attestation is also somehow relying on hardware. So can we manipulate this attestation circuit? So it's really be opening a can of worms here, because and I'm not claiming this is easier, can always be done, but I think, and I don't have an answer for that, but I think at least implicitly we always assume that the hardware works correctly, right? I mean, even if we, you know, you know, really big in conspiracy theories, maybe we don't trust any part of the software, only a tiny bit, right? But implicitly, we only assume, okay, the hardware is just Intel or ARM, right? That's running correctly. So I think you could always make an argument, okay, at what point could an attacker manipulate the hardware and invalidate it? But this is maybe, I'm jumping probably 2 or 3 steps ahead. Your basic answer is right. With remote attestation, it's not a bad thing to do and to check the integrity of the bitstream. Yeah. The first attack, not. I mean, if you go after randomness sources, right? I don't know how to attest that, right? It's the analog part. Well, that was the digital part, but you could also think about similar attacks against the analog part. How can you check that this is really running correctly? This is a very scary thing.
Yeah, are there other questions from the audience? If not, I can, I'll follow up just with Christof. Yeah, I agree that attestation will need to rely on hardware, so we would have the same problem. But on one side, if one could architect the system, the hardware, so that you use a different portion of the hardware, okay? The problem would be that for an attacker, it should compromise a lot. And perhaps when a lot is compromised, the macro effects could be more visible.
Yeah, and we had a paper last year on looking at microcode Trojans, which is kind of in between. And this is a little bit, Elisa, what you're saying. If you want to then make them smart, if you have only a CPU, I mean, here in both cases, they dedicated hardware blocks with easily to, you know, manipulate the function. If you have the software, and then you look at the CPU architecture, this is universal, right? That runs the Excel sheet, your OS, your boot loading, blah, 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 blah. And so doing a targeted hardware attack on a general purpose CPU is harder. So we have some ideas, right? For instance, we think if you use microcode, this makes it considerably easier. But you're right, Elisa. Normally, you often have this effect, and you suddenly destroy a lot of things, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Now we have a long question from the audience, from Yassin. Christoph, can you read the question?
Yeah, I think I can do that. Yes.
Yeah, because if I read, that will take forever.
Yeah. Okay, the first question is, I would like to know if the adoption of tamper-protected devices can mitigate the injection of hardware Trojans. No, I mean, if anything, well, it depends on the attack vector. So the question is if you have tamper-protected devices. So these attacks that are showed here, at least the first attack, right? This is not happening in the field, right? And tamper detection works in the field, right? Once you have a fielded device, you can detect that. So I think all the standard detection mechanism will not work. In the second case, that might work because we have to fiddle around with the flash, right? In particular, if that becomes invasive, you know, good old tamper detection of your hardware box might work. But then on the other side, a lot of FPGA designs are now so configured that you can do an over-the-air bitstream update, right? So you don't have to physically touch that. So in general, I don't think that tamper detection solves most of the problem of hardware Trojans. Secondly, do you think that hardware security modules can resist against hardware Trojan? Yeah, so really what it boils down to, and actually, as we speak, we look at the Open Titan a lot, because this is kind of a open source hardware with as a security root of trust anchor. It's not so much the security functionality in your hardware security module. It's how trusted is this whole design chain. You know, who designs the hardware, who has access to the hardware supply chain, and so forth, right? So it's you could probably argue that the hardware security module is as secure or unsecure as you know, like your Intel processor, for instance, right? Because we're not going after the core security functions. There's another question by Philip.
Yeah. Right.
Oh, okay, yeah, we're running out. No, we have a little bit of time. Regarding the tier 2 random number generator attack, would it be possible to detect the reduction of entropy with simple countermeasures? Not with simple ones, and actually there's even an old NIST standard, I think, that dates back to the 1970s and 1980s, which asks for so-called, well, what's sometimes called health tests. That means you have a TRNG and you're constantly monitoring, but these tests are relatively simple. So, like, for instance, you count how many zeros and ones do you have, how many runs of 2 zeros and 2 ones you have. There's a whole number. They're like, there's a NIST or FIP standard on that. There may be 6 or 7 tests, and they're relatively simple. Remember what we did, we didn't throw all entropy out. We still had an entropy of 2 to the 32, which is quite a lot, right? That means all these simple measures that test the entropy will fail, right? There's actually, there was a follow-up paper to our attack by Shai Guaron in Haifa. And what he did, which is kind of a targeted testing, and he used the birthday paradox, kind of a Schönheitsfehler, so kind of a not so nice property of our attack is that at some points the random numbers repeat. And as we know, because of the birthday paradox, for instance, with an entropy of 2 to the 32, you don't have to wait 2 to the 32, but after 2 to the 16, which is quick. That means after about 65,000 times evoking the TRNG, you would get a repetition that would tell you, well, you know, something is going wrong here. There might be a Trojan built in. That means in practice, 32-bit entropy is not enough. You have to go to larger one. So what I'm trying to say, there are ways of detecting that depending on the parameters, but they're not necessarily particularly simple, right? You have to run a lot of IOs. Yeah. Marcel has a question. Would you see a possibility to apply these kind of attacks on the memory protection isolation function? We haven't looked at that, but my basic question is yes. I would be really surprised, you know, if you overcome, for the trust zone concept. There's nothing that prevents us from hardware design engineers to find some clever ways to invalidate that. Typically, what you know, the what the people who work on Trojan classification. There's been some very nice work done in the US. They distinguish between triggers and payloads. So trigger is easy to understand, right? A Trojan needs a trigger, or maybe it's an always-on Trojan, it's permanently triggered. It's more elegant, right? From an attacker point of view, it can be selectively triggered by some outside event. But then, Marcel, your question is, what is a payload? And payload means what does a Trojan actually does? What is a bad thing, right? And for instance, you could switch off the trust zone type of thing, right? And I don't think there's anything principally that prevents us from doing that, right? And then you get this kind of exploitation level of attacks, which you could argue much more powerful than what we did with this 3NRG stuff. Yeah, but it's a very good question, Marcel.
Yeah, other questions? So, but Christof, you are not off yet. So, so from the questions that I could see, basically there are two interesting directions of research. One is, as Marcel, the question pointed out, is to see whether other attacks are possible to other part of the hardware. But as you said, this depends on what you can really change as a functionality, okay? That which means understanding the software above in a way. But people are also keen a lot on defenses. So do we have any hope to come up with defenses here?
Yeah.
You know, which research should we be doing?
Yeah. They actually, I mentioned that before, and maybe I was a little bit too negative about it. There's been nice work on defenses on that, right? And a lot of the defenses has to do with the attacker model, right? So, you know, at which level do you trust? And I think the most extreme case is maybe if it's built-in built-in backdoor, built-in Trojan by the manufacturer, right? And here I'm somewhat critical whether you can really prevent that. If you have like a really sneaky Trojan in also modern hardware devices, this is not that widely known in the software community. They're routinely obfuscated, right? So you have this nowadays absurdly complex circuits, right? Literally consisting of hundreds of millions of gates. And if a hardware company, right, the designer really tries to hide this Trojan, it might be very hard. But this is an extreme case, right? Yeah. So the main thing you know we are worried about is backdoors that are built in new manufacturing, for instance, right? And they're all kind of first like I think kind of system level checks, right? But they're also advanced checks that are for instance, often if you assume a golden model, this is one assumption that they have is we send our design overseas, right? And you know, after 10 weeks, we get the first chip, and then they sometimes assume this first batch of chips doesn't have a Trojan because it takes the attacker, you know, weeks and weeks to reverse engineer that, right? But maybe next year, right, when we keep buying chips from that manufacturer that's vulnerable. So there are situations where you assume, okay, the first chips are original, and then from now on, over the lifetime of this product, right, we do some kind of checks, and they're all kind of things. You can optically check, you can do a side channel check. So you look, for instance, at the power consumption, right, the dynamic power consumption, right, and assuming if people, you know, add gates to it, for instance, will be detected. But what we don't have kind of the equivalent of like strong cryptography, right? There is no way of, you know, doing this, use algorithm X, and then we've won. It's probably the same mess that we have with software security, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, are there other questions from the audience? Oh, somebody has another question on the chat.
Yeah, this is a good question by Frank, and he asked, and which is a scary thing. So can we manipulate transistors post-production? Yes, what definitely can be done, which seems like the wilder thing. No, I don't know. No, it's not wilder. So what you definitely can do in a given chip, you can, within limits, you can add new metal layers. You can connect certain part of your design with a focused ion beam, right? This is, for instance, done to repair chips, even sometimes after manufacturing. If there are manufacturing defects, you can, again, you can't reroute your entire chip, right? But you could do things that could be useful for an attacker, right? You could connect certain transistors to 0 or ground and, you know, invalidate certain part of your key register or stuff. It's definitely possible. I think this doping you can also do from the backside, but this is a pretty major undertaking, right? And that would also definitely be visible, I would guess, right? That would be detectable. Yeah, but it's a good question, Frank.
I think we are at the end of the session. So I would like to thank Christof for sharing with us his perspective on this very challenging topic. We hope to see more research to be done. Okay, now before we kind of stop for the break, I have some announcement that the organizers, you know, the general chair asked me to mention. So first of all, remember, after the break, we have still 4 parallel sessions. Okay. So they are all covered very interesting and timely topics. But then we haven't done yet for the day. And we have a 7:30, 7 p.m. European Central Time, the business meeting. This is a very important meeting because this is the opportunity for all of you to provide your input, feedback to this edition of ESORIX. The general chair, I and myself, we have observed, seen many things, and we are happy to share them with you. So, you know, your attendance will be very important to make this discussion alive, come up with suggestions for next year edition of ESORIX. Okay. Again, I would like to thank again Christof and the audience for the many interesting things. But at the end, I'm saying getting even more worried about the hardware than I was before. Okay. What can I say? This is life. Okay, but I'm sure researchers like Christof can lead toward the more effective solutions. I hope to address those concerns. Okay, take care and see you at the session and at the business meeting. Okay, thanks again, Chris. It was really great.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good evening for the Europeans.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.